I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this referendum and the broader concerns that it raises. And I do so recognizing that reasonable people will disagree on this issue, and I hope that we can do so without calling into question one another's good faith or concern with reaching a just and secure peace in the Middle East that will include a Palestinian state alongside the Israeli state. I think this is a very important conversation for us to be having. And I want to raise questions and reflections about the referendum under three headings. So first, the role of the university. Second, the ethics of singling out. And then finally, a better way forward. So first, the university context. Divestment is a question with a long history. And the university has recognized in its existing guidelines, which are adopted by the Resources Committee of the Council of the Princeton University community, that there may be cases when divestment is the right action. And I agree with that. So I want to say that I think it's right that the university has guidelines that acknowledge that divestment may sometimes, in some cases, be justified. And that makes it all the more important for us to have a conversation beginning from those guidelines about whether this is such a case. And I think that one of the strange things to me, and I think it's disappointing, is that both the faculty petition in the fall and this student referendum exist as it were in a vacuum. They make no mention of those guidelines, which are the guidelines that exist to guide our conversation as a university community. Now, when we actually look at those guidelines, they stress that a case for divestment must articulate a central university value that is clearly at stake. And they also say that such values do not encompass particular political or social strategies for achieving them. So that is, one can have a value, that doesn't mean that one has to follow a particular strategy that some people think is the best way to realize the value. Now, in this case, as I say, the referendum doesn't actually address the guidelines at all, but if we try to interpret what is the value that's at stake, what's discussed most and stressed in the text of the referendum is the value of compliance with international law. Now, I think that is important. I think it's also important to note that that was actually not the value that was at stake in the movement against apartheid in South Africa. And I want to say that I was very much involved in the anti-apartheid movement as an undergraduate and calling for divestment. And so I need to be frank and reflective with you and with myself about why I think this case is different. And as I said, I recognize, therefore, that one can argue that there are cases in which divestment is justified. I think it was justified in that case. So as I understand it, the apartheid regime engaged in a principled denial of the very possibility of the entitlement of Black South Africans to political equality and to political rights. They denied that in principle, ever, Black South Africans were entitled to that standing. And that was a breach of what Hannah Arendt has called the right to have rights. We couldn't even talk about violations of human rights because, as it were, Black South Africans didn't have any rights as citizens at all to be protected within their state. And I believe that that was a unique challenge to the very basis of human rights and so to a central university value. Because it was a unique denial, not that there's a political conflict which is in practice at the present depriving people of certain rights and not enabling them to have full political determination. And there are many such political conflicts in the world, as my colleagues have said. This was a denial that in principle, this people should ever be entitled to that standing. Now, I do recognize that every generation wants its own cause, and actually that it's dangerous to say, oh, the causes of the past, those were morally obvious, the Nazis, apartheid. It's obvious now that those were evils, grave moral evils. And I think it's right that we should search our consciences and say, are there evils today that are so grave and unique, but that we may not be seeing? And indeed, at the time in the 1980s, apartheid was one of those. Many people didn't see it. It was far from a universal view. So I think it's right that we ask this question. Now, when I ask myself that question as an American citizen, though, if I ask myself a question about international law and breaches of international law, I answer, fundamentally, what do I think is the occupation and the breach of international law that I, as an American citizen, have immediate primary concern with over the last 10 years? I would say it's the invasion and the occupation of Iraq. I think that the US arguably committed a massive breach with the invasion, and indeed the occupation of Iraq. That was an occupation, but there was no comparable movement against that, and I think that opposition to occupation should begin at home, and that we all have to search our consciences as to why there was less opposition to that than perhaps there should have been. Now, many people will say, well, yes, but the US gives massive military assistance to Israel, and so anything that happens that Israel does is also a grave concern of the United States. Now, as my colleagues have pointed out, the same order of magnitude, it's second, but it's a similar order of magnitude of aid is also given to Egypt. And both Israel and Egypt together have important responsibilities, both for the present situation, particularly of Palestinians in Gaza. Indeed, Egypt also, in the years in which it ruled Gaza, from 1948 to 1967, it occupied Gaza, did not bring about a Palestinian state in that time, nor did Jordan in the West Bank. But I think that both Israel and Egypt then have a role right now that they could play in rectifying the situation, an important role, and bringing that about. So that brings me then to the second question. Is this resolution, this referendum, singling out Israel? And if it is that morally problematic? And again, I think this is a real moral issue that it's right that we should consider. What is wrong with singling out, if actually singling out is what's being done? And indeed, I took the opportunity when I had the honor of addressing the undergraduate Human Values Forum in December. I gave a talk called The Ethics of Singling Out, where I didn't specifically talk about this, about this case, but I tried to reflect on what are the ethics of singling out? Is it really so bad? Because I think we have to ask ourselves that question. So first of all, my colleagues have pointed out that while the referendum in the proposal part mentions not only the Israeli occupation, but also those companies which facilitate Egypt's collective punishment of Palestinian civilians and state repression by Israeli, Egyptian, and Palestinian Authority security forces. So they mention not only Israel, but the official explanation of the sponsoring body of the referendum. So this is not just the website, but actually in the text which is submitted by the sponsors of the referendum, which is put forward together with the wording of the question itself, that concludes the purpose is, quote, to put, quote, international pressure on the Israeli government to facilitate the end of the oppression of the Palestinian people. So again, when we're told what the purpose is to put pressure on the Israeli government, even though these other agents were also mentioned. So I think Israel is being singled out in the referendum. The purpose is stated to be to put pressure on Israel. Now, how can we think about the ethics of singling out? So I think there are two principles that both have a certain intuitive force. So one is what a child might say, and I think not just a child, but any of us who feel we're being treated unfairly, we might say, it's not fair to single me out because they're doing it too. Right? We feel intuitively that if many people are doing the same wrong and only one is punished, that's a breach of the very idea of what it is to have a norm and to try to apply it. I think there is intuitive force to that thought. Now there is also some intuitive force, though, to an opposite thought, which is just because they do wrong is no reason for you to do it, right? And I think there is some intuitive force to that thought. And further to the thought, well, we can't all oppose every wrong in the world, so why not start here? Why not do this one? Why is it wrong to do this, even if we can't do everything else? Now, I think one question that arises there is the question of the meaning of can't. It's far from clear that we can't do everything else. We could, the sponsors of this referendum could have been consistent in not just mentioning at one point these other agents in the conflict, but actually consistently calling and addressing on all parties to the conflict to actually bring about peace. So there's no sense in which that can't be done. We can talk about more than one issue. And so I think the idea that we can't do everything is a rather weak kind of reply. But I do accept that some people will have reason to adopt a particular cause and to care about that cause particularly, maybe for reasons of personal history, personal involvement. Some people will devote themselves to singling out in a certain way. But it doesn't, but I think but nevertheless, I think it's important that all of us, including people who are tempted to do that, remember that there's a moral obligation not just to focus the searchlight of moral criticism, but also to sweep the searchlight so that it fairly covers all aspects of reality. Now you might say, well, okay, even if this is singling out, but still, Israel is a state, it's tough, it can take it. You know, is it so bad to single out a state? What's so wrong with that? Well, I think it is wrong for a number of reasons, and I want to mention two. One is that I think that it does distort our understanding of reality. I think that if Israel is presented as the only country which is an obstacle to peace in the Middle East, or indeed in the world, that actually distorts our understanding of what's going on and what could really bring about a change. And indeed, pragmatically, I think that that kind of singling out is both unlikely to succeed and it's counterproductive. I think that if one thinks about it, if what's being asked for is that to put international pressure on Israel to withdraw, what's the best case scenario that singly directed pressure could provide? It would be the kind of unilateral withdrawal that we've seen in Gaza, which is far from having produced a stable peace or an improved humanitarian situation for the Palestinians in Gaza. So that brings me then to my final point, which is to end on a positive note. So I think that it's right that we have this conversation. We have a university policy which allows us to consider whether divestment is appropriate in certain circumstances. I've argued that in my view, it isn't in this circumstance, but I think it's right that we have the conversation. I think it's right that we can think about particular countries, but it's also right that we should hold ourselves to a higher standard of considering countries widely, including our own country, for those who are American citizens. I think that to condemn occupation by others and not acknowledge the role that Americans have played in violating international laws or bringing about occupations, to me, is really not appropriate. But then I want to end on the more positive note. What's the more constructive action that could be taken? And I think my colleagues have begun to point these ways forward. The real question is, how can we bring about that constructive change? And I understand that people are impatient. People are tired of the occupation. It's right that it should end. It's right that a Palestinian state should be established. And so we are grasping for what can we do to register that concern and to help to bring it about. But here I would suggest that the aim of working together in projects that can build mutual trust and make an immediate impact on the ground today, that can help with concrete challenges on the ground, challenges of environmental development, healthcare, business development, and again, mutual trust. To me, those are more constructive paths that are open to us to take. And so I would urge students to consider, in voting on the referendum, whether there's a better way to signal the values that you care about and to stand up for them than supporting this case for divestment. Thank you.